The next three characters belong to the single coolest cyborg super soldier design I ever saw. They have all the standard traits like super speed, super strength, being able to heal much faster than a normal person, infrared sight, and just lots of smaller implants. But most of all, their regime uses their extremely advanced plastic surgery technologies to make them look intimidating. They're basically weaponized Uncanny Valley. The characters are the protagonist Telly Youngblood, the deuteragonist, so basically a second protagonist who doesn't have her own point of view, Shay, who is her volatile best friend, and the antagonist, Dr. Cable, all from Scott Westerfeld's Uglies series, which are these books that came out between 2005 and 2007. Only Dr. Cable starts out as a cyborg, but the themes of this video, I choose this for us present right from the beginning. Because of this, it will look like just an analysis of all the queer and disabled themes in these books, with not that much about cyborgs for a relatively long time, but trust me, it's all going to come together in the third book. After several failed attempts, it also finally got a movie adaptation in 2024, and all of the actors completely nailed the characters, but they also didn't quite manage to bring the depth across, so I will mostly focus on the books and only mention the movie if there is something different from the books it does in an interesting way. I also thought about including The Scorpion Rules by Erin Bow, which is another amazing YA dystopia with transhumanism themes that, unlike Uglies, also actually managed to make the main character and her best friend canonically bisexual. However, I still haven't finished the second book, so I thought I wasn't quite up for the task. The books take place in this seemingly perfect post-scarcity society. Telly awaits the plastic surgery at age 16 that will make her finally fit in and start her carefree life. However, as Shay, who is openly critical of the system, disappears, she's blackmailed to find her. The very first thing we learn about Telly is that she's lonely. Everybody in her year has an earlier birthday than her and so already changed over to the other side of the river, including her best friend Paris. So she's stuck in her dorm completely alone. She despises her body and how she looks, just as her society told her, but it feels deeper than this. She doesn't think she is worthy to belong in her current state, and she has been taught that the surgery will change that. The second thing we learn is that she's a trickster. She deeply understands all the complicated technology the dorm and the AAE use to keep her and the others safe. And she has a talent for noticing gaps in these systems and exploiting that for her own goals. She knows that her room is programmed to talk with her, but also not really intelligent enough to notice when she's lying, so she says goodnight to it. She knows that the room surveils her by seeing the warmth of her body, so she puts a heater under her blanket and climbs out of the window. She knows that the city knows where a citizen is over their interface ring, and that the interface ring also shows the exact age of the person wearing it, so she leaves hers in her room, and instead of going over the bridge where she would have been recognized from her interface ring, she climbs along underneath it to the other side of the river. She manages to meet Paris, but after that, their entire plan dissolves into chaos. She starts a fire alarm and jumps off the building with a bungee jacket that is actually meant to be used in an actual fire, which then causes firefighters and wardens to swarm into the city, and Telly not quite knowing how to get out of this without being seen. This is where she meets Shay, who also snuck to the other riverside, but unlike Telly is able to fly a hoverboard and knows how to manipulate the brain of the hoverboard to not tell the authorities that she is somewhere where she shouldn't be. They are immediately fascinated by each other. They teach each other all their tricks, and Shay teaches Tally how to hoverboard. Turns out they also have the same birthday, which means they won't be left alone again. Shay takes Tally's mischievousness further. Once Tally is good enough on a hoverboard for this, they first visit the river, which is the only way to get out of the city on a hoverboard because all this hover technology needs the metal grid under the city to fly, but the river has enough minerals with metallic components that it can also fly. After that, she even takes her to the ruins of an old city by a civilization they call the Rusties, which are relatively obviously our civilization. Shay also wants to introduce someone named David to Tally, who apparently is from outside the cities, but he never shows up, and Tally believes that he doesn't actually exist, but is just a campfire story. Shay also begins to be more and more openly critical of the system, which Tally is horrified of. She tries to discuss Shay out of it, but she just changes the subject and they do something else. Shay wants to design herself a face that is outside the parameters the Morphologic Committee, not to mention their own city, which has a bit of a reputation of being a hardliner, would allow. And doesn't listen to Tally reasoning that differences like this would make disadvantages between people possible again. And then later, as it gets more and more radical, Shay actually begins to get angry over this, which Tally can't really deal that well with. This escalates as they flee to a lake after a prank as an excuse to get rid of all their costumes. Tally jokes about how the costume made Shay's face look, to which Shay caresses her face and tells her that her eyes are beautiful and that her entire profile is beautiful. Tally is not able to believe this and tries to discuss her out of it, like always. And this time, Shay is furious. She shouts about how horrifying she thinks the surgery is and how she doesn't want the city control all her life and have her entire life planned out for her. And they just part, and Tally isn't able to find Shay for several days. Then suddenly, Shay appears at Tally's window and tells her that the reason she was on the other riverside was that her and her friends, who would all get the surgery around that time, planned to run away to some place outside the city called the Smoke. However, Shay and some of the others didn't dare to do this. But thanks to the others being slightly older, she ended up being the only one left behind. Now she explains that meeting Tally and seeing her pull up all of these tricks made her brave enough to go through with the plan and run away to the Smoke, and she invites Tally to join her. Tally says that it's too dangerous and that Shay is just afraid to grow up and leave behind all their antics. It has this hint of her believing that growing up is accepting her place in the system. Shay also again caresses her face in a way that doesn't really read platonic, but doesn't let herself be swayed. She leaves behind a poem that describes the way to the Smoke, and the two say farewell for what they believe is forever. I felt so seen by their dynamic as a teenager. They both don't quite fit into the system and are both lonely and both want community, but Tally still conforms and believes in the system, while Shay is brave enough to be rebellious. I had so many female friendships that had the exact same dynamics, including the weird homoeroticism and just general toxicity. It's so strange to me how, as I first read this, I didn't notice the queer subtext at all. At least not consciously, but I think I did on a subconscious level because I would also relate a lot to the parts of their friendship that read like bisexual girls not quite having realized yet that they are bisexual, that I also found in my own friendships. Finally, it is Tally's birthday, but she doesn't get the surgery. She just gets transported to a weirdly unaesthetic building full of people with a surgery she has never seen before. They are taller than pretties usually are. They are very angular. They have quite brutal looking faces and their movement is too fast and too sudden. She's instinctively scared of them. But what's looking back after reading the full series is interesting is that one of her first thoughts is that something about her must be too broken to get the regular pretty surgery and she will have to end up like these people instead. She is led to a room with a woman who seems to have some kind of leadership position. Up close, this surgery is even more terrifying. She is relatively close to how the morphologic committee allows a pretty to look, but looks brutal and raw-boned instead of vulnerable and young. She has way too intense eyes in a tone of grey the morphologic committee would definitely never allow her. There is something very off about the way she moves and even emotes. Telly doesn't know what she is exactly at this point, but she already feels that she isn't quite human anymore. She introduces herself as Dr. Cable. Her voice is elegant and deep and close to being friendly, but has a sharp, threatening edge to it that prevents it from being anything but commanding. Telly asks for her first name because everybody in this society refers to each other by their first name and Telly doesn't really know how to interact with someone with only using their last name. Dr. Cable refuses. However, Telly at least gets her to explain in what kind of agency she ended up here. Dr. Cable has her teeth searched to fangs and Telly can't help but stare at them. Dr. Cable describes the city as a paradise. It gives Telly housing, it gives her food, it gives her the surgery and all other healthcare. It protects from the environment. It keeps humans out of nature and is entirely self-containing so that no waste pollutes the outside and the different cities don't have to rely on each other. The agency is called Special Circumstances, and they are there to protect the city from anything from the outside that could endanger it. And the smoke is one of these dangers because they have been luring young people outside since years, and Special Circumstances can't find them. They already made a copy of Shay's note, but since it consists entirely out of references to things Telly and Shay have talked about, they can't decrypt it. Only Telly can follow the instructions. Already in this first scene, along with being described as being weirdly machine-like, Dr. Cable is also linked with the image of being a wolf. Fiercely protective of her own people, but ruthless and brutal to everybody who threatens them. Telly worries about Shay, but also wants to keep her promise to her. With that, Dr. Cable drops the last pretense of being nice and says that Telly will only get the surgery once she had found the smoke for special circumstances. And after being reassured from both her parents and Paris that this is the right way, Telly gives in. I think that this is where her story lost a lot of readers. It seems hard to relate to betray your friend just for plastic surgery because in our society this is really not a problem. But in this society, this is the path of life that everybody has to take, and not taking it would make Telly a total pariah. And it's also not just plastic surgery, but that Telly thinks that getting this plastic surgery is the only way she could possibly belong and be happy. And also this scene was such a game changer in terms of villains for me. Even by now it's still relatively rare, but back then I had never seen a female villain who wasn't defined by her gender at all. She isn't seductive, or ended up being a villain because of some boyfriend brought her into it, or is overly emotional, and she isn't even described in typical female terms. We know that she's a conventionally attractive woman because Tally mentions that, but every other description could just as well be a description of a man or any other gender. If you would change her character to being a man, the only thing you would have to do is to change pronouns and literally nothing else. This completely flabbergasted me as a teen. To put this into context, Uglies came out in 2005. This was the same year the Brokeback Mountain movie came out, and also the same year Twilight, the book, came out. It was 3 years before Hunger Games would be published and 5 years before the YA dystopia genre had its main popularity. It was an entire trend cycle ahead of its time. The shift between YA dystopia as just the same tropes as adult dystopia but with kids to being its own genre is kind of gradual, from The Giver to Shadow Children and Feet. But by mine and a lot of other fans of the genre's definition, this was the first modern YA dystopia. So you can imagine how new and groundbreaking seeing a female villain who was described in gender-neutral terms and who was a villain from the same motivations male villains have instead of some kind of weird sexist stuff distilled from typical media female roles. I don't think I ever saw a female villain who saw herself as a weapon and basically willingly dehumanized herself in any other media outside of some kind of weird sexualized fetishy stuff that doesn't really count for me. This is probably also where her vaguely queer vibes come from. We never see anything about her private life or her sexuality, and still in every single shippy fic containing her, she is shipped with a woman. And it's also visible in how a large part of the fandom fan-casted her in the almost 20 years up to the adaptation. For other characters, there were just widely accepted headcanons about their ethnicity, for example that Tally is black or Shay is a Latina. But for Dr. Cable, most people seem to agree that she would have to be played by Tilda Swinton. So this middle-aged white actress who is basically known for looking quite androgynous with a pointy face and just slightly unsettling in an ethereal way. She even outed herself as queer in 2021, though she didn't specify in which way. I don't think anybody expected who they would actually cast as Dr. Cable in the adaptation. Laverne Cox became famous for playing a side character in Orange is the New Black, who, like her, was a black trans woman. And since then, she became a very influential intersectional feminist and pretty much the most famous trans actress at all. She was listed for longer as playing a part in the movie, but IMDb didn't really list the roles up until very close before the trailer came out, so most people, me included, assumed she would play Maddie, who is the leader of the rebels and also the mother of one of Tally's love interests. She is so good at playing Dr. Cable. Already her voice. It's implied that Dr. Cable's voice is surgically altered to be intimidating, and up until the trailer I wasn't really sure if it would even be possible to create this voice in live action and make it sound like it was described in the books. And she totally pulled it off. I remember first hearing her in the trailer and just thinking, yeah, that's her. That's Dr. Cable. She also is the only one of the actors who play the specials who actually pulls it off to look like the specials were described in the book. She's a bit more human than in the book, but there's still something subtly unsettling about the way she moves and her expressions and her eyes in this very strange, unnatural grey tone that's way too intense. There were moments in the movie where she was just too beautiful to look at in a way that almost felt painful. I didn't expect her to look feminine. After the movie, I went through the books again, and turns out that the way Dr. Cable dresses or her hair is actually never described, but I could have sworn that she was described as looking quite masculine and always wearing her uniform and having relatively short hair. But it works better like this. For me, as someone who was always more masculine and always a failure at womanhood, it's fascinating to see her being feminine and wearing all of these beautiful futuristic dresses, being shown as a sign of her power. Because she actually is in a position that it's powerful enough to have that be a choice. There are videos saying it's anti-feminist to criticize women being forced into being feminine and only her as a villain being feminine, which is still such a weird complaint for me. In which world do you live that women and people assumed to be women aren't still forced into femininity? Women who feel better in practical or masculine clothing do exist. And yeah, there are different rules for different situations and demographics, and the expectations of femininity are different between a white cis woman and a black trans woman. But I don't understand this weird choice feminism idea of, oh, I am actually happy in the femininity patriarchy expects for me, so it has to be feminist. It doesn't have to be something inherently negative, but it is still something that is forced on people, and it's not anti-feminist to criticize that. Sorry for that tangent. Anyway, another quite cool thing the movie did was managing to keep this gender-neutral framing of Dr. Cable. Which is impressive because in a book you only see the things the author describes, but in a movie they have no choice but to show this absolutely gorgeous, curvy woman in these in parts quite sexy clothes, and they still pulled it off. They never did these weird panning over the actress' body shots that they often use to show that this character is desirable and that the male hero is oogling her. She's always only framed in a way that shows her power and occasionally the other character's fear of her. She was always on my list of favorite villains ever since I first read the book, but Laverne Cox's performance brought that to a whole nother level for me. Sadly, most discussions online don't talk about that, but just describe her as a transphobic stereotype. So my initial thought is that I trust Laverne Cox being able to understand the character and understand what is and isn't harmful for the community more than I trust some random person on some social media site. Now, don't get me wrong, sadly it does happen quite often that unknown trans actresses are forced into some kind of transphobic role because this is the only kind of role they can get at all. But Cox is quite famous at this point and has a quite well-running career. And what also happens in such situations quite often is damage control. Because if a trans actress plays this transphobic role, she will at least have some very small chance to make it lesser dangerous. Which I also don't think applies here, because from what I heard, Cox was casted as Dr. Cable specifically to highlight the hypocrisy of this regime to claim that prejudice doesn't exist anymore, but only if you play into the system. If she hadn't taken the role, I'm relatively sure it would just have gone to some cis actress and maybe even some creepy-eyed middle-aged white woman. And I am a firm believer that asking minorities to never be villains, or if you take this even further, never be any flawed characters, that is actually dehumanizing too. Originally, I wanted to go into the symbolism and world building because this society feels so very much not like our culture, with their different ideas about gender and body. But I am not a trans woman, so this is just not my place. And in the current climate, it just seems too risky if I would get something wrong. I just want to point out a few things that, in my opinion, are important for judging this character. Dr. Cable isn't canonically trans. She does have this one line about knowing how horrible it is to long for your surgery and have the body you always wanted, but, well, this society controls their entire age case from 12 to 16 by essentially body dysmorphia, so that doesn't have to mean she's trans. It's perfectly possible that she's a cis woman who just happens to look like Laverne Cox. And for the unlikely case that someone listening to this wants to tell me something about some arbitrary feature that isn't possible for cis women to have, please go outside and look at real people. Also, in-universe, thanks to the watcher basically don't knowing anything about Dr. Cable's past and private life, in the book we don't even know her first name, in-universe it wouldn't really make a difference if she's trans or cis. There's nothing about her behavior and character and motivations that would change. And I know that this doesn't really matter because, well, the perception of the viewer changes. But it still seems necessary to acknowledge that. I even saw someone say that the movie only exists as transphobic propaganda, which is just so gross, not just towards Cox, but also towards Scott Westerfield. He's a queer ally since at least 2003, and while I'm not sure at which point he started also being trans ally, I follow him on Twitter since, well, I would say probably 8 years or something like that, and in this entire time he's constantly spreading leftist political stuff and defending trans people and defending other minorities. He even got into fights with some high-ranking transphobes a few times. This just shows such a complete disregard for the genre to not just do this small basic research before claiming such things, but, well, it's YA dystopia, it's just love triangles and shallow cringe girl science fiction, right? Dr. Cable is also far from the only vaguely trans, or as Tumblr would say it, very gender character in Uglies series. She isn't even the only special. Uglies series sadly doesn't have canonically queer characters, but again, it came out in the same year as the Brokeback Mountain movie came out. But the sequel series, Imposters, has a prominent trans side character. They start out as just some spoiled kid friend of the protagonist's love interest, but end up becoming a more and more important link to the local rebels over the span of the books. Apparently, the most progressive thing is to take this character with a role that is still rare for a female villain to have, who has some fascinating science fiction concepts, and to take this amazing, difficult performance and reduce it down to transphobic stereotypes, because this character is played by a black trans actress. That just doesn't sit right with me. Unfortunately, they didn't lean into the queer subtext between Telly and Shay for the movie. In fact, they toned it down, which, in my opinion, is a really bad choice, because Uglies is pretty much the first book to use these tropes that then, after that, all other YA dystopias were using and finally overusing, really would have needed something new. Before that, I kind of assumed that at least part of the subtext was intentional, because, well, the Ryzen Empire came out directly before Uglies and has a canon sapphic ship. But if Westerfield had wanted it to be canon, it would have been canon in the movie. Telly was played by Joey King, which seemed like a really bad choice because Telly in the book is tall and chubby or fat, while Joey King is very short and very petite. But turns out she also was a huge fan of the series and even managed to get Netflix to adapt it. And she gets the character's vibes so right that I barely noticed it. Brianna Yu as Shay, however, was very obviously a very fitting choice, not just with being skinny, androgynous, and kind of pointy like Shay in the book, but also being, even in real life, quite often quite butch dressed. And they do have chemistry. I am not going into them being too pretty and too old to truly get the real depth of the message across, because it's not a problem for the reason these people think. And I also know that there are people who would need these explanations and this deep dive the most would just not listen. So I don't waste my time, especially because this doesn't really have that much to do with the topic of the video anyway. Well, the movie cut out pretty much all of the not really platonic looking face touching and cuddling. There were a few additional moments. As they first meet, they don't just stumble into each other, but Shay heroically sweeps in to save Telly. Telly has absolute hurt eyes as she watches Shay do some tricks on her hoverboard. Telly carries her around on her back, and even a moment where Telly jumps out of her helicopter into a burning field to save Shay. And Shay has short hair in the movie instead of 2 long braids like in the book. I also like the symbolism of Shay right from the beginning, wearing the version of the school uniform with trousers, but Telly mostly wearing a skirt and only starting to wear trousers when she starts her journey of finding herself. It's interesting how Telly, despite her movie version being so much shorter and lighter, still has the same physicality as her book counterpart. She easily hauls herself up the bridge, she carries Shay around, and she has multiple scenes where she tackles someone to the ground. But the most interesting use of the film medium, and something the books genuinely couldn't show, is their expressions. Telly, Shay, David, and all the other Uglies have the whole range of normal human expressions, even those that look unflattering and distort their faces. Telly especially has so many really dorky teen expressions. The pretties and specials don't have that, and it's especially jarring to see that happen with a character we know as an ugly. Other than the beauty standards and the artificialness, it also feels like a neurodiversity allegory. Because doing the right expressions or failing to do so is such a huge part in why neurodivergent people are mistreated. To understand the rest, I have to spoiler all 3 books. I tried to come up with a way to shorten this, but there's just so many small details that feed into this I don't think I would have managed without reducing the meaning. Telly starts her journey equipped with a long-distance hoverboard which can recharge in the sun, a heart-shaped pendant that also functions as a position finder to call special circumstances, and a backpack with a sleeping bag, other things she needs, and, it turns out, exclusively spaghetti bolognese for food. Which is Dr. Cable's fault and the only time we see her as anything but the leader of special circumstances in the first book. The journey through the vast wilderness outside the cities changes her perspective even more than the short trips to the ruins and the river with Shay. She nearly gets burned as rangers set a field of white orchids that double as a metaphor for this society on fire, trying to stop their suffocating spread. But then they also take her up with them in their helicopter. Finally, she meets Shay again and with her David, who is real, and a few other teenagers. Shay directly asks her about the heart-shaped pendant, and an interesting detail is that she uses gender-neutral language for it. But Telly says it's not important. She is creeped out by how they are cutting down trees and eating animals, which reminds her too much at the kind of environmental destruction our civilization did. but there are too many people around her to call special circumstances. After that, she postpones activating the pendant more and more as she gets different tasks to do around the smoke and becomes more and more part of the group. The physical work helps her with her sleep problems, which I'm aware that neurodivergent people are not the only people who can have sleep problems, but it is a common symptom. She also is really happy about her muscles growing after 2 weeks, which is just such a sapphic mood. David is fascinated by Tally managing to make the whole way to the smoke completely alone and also understanding how serious this is. And him and Tally slowly get closer until he finally gifts her his self-made gloves. Shay sees this and goes absolutely ballistic. She is hurt that David cares so much more about Tally because she is in love with him too. But what makes this much lesser a cliché about two girls fighting about a boy is that it comes across as Shay being much more jealous of David than she is of Tally for ending up with David. It also establishes how much rage Shay has, which will get more and more important the further the series goes. After that, Tally wants to go back to the cities, but David tells her that he wants to show her something before that. He takes her to his parents. This is where the neurodivergent allegory really starts. Maddie and As are former plastic surgeons for the city, and they were high-ranking enough that for their research projects they were allowed to look at data from everybody who had the surgery. They noticed that everybody has a lesion, so basically a small healed scar in their brain at exactly the same spot. At first they assume it's accidental and a side effect from the anesthetic they use for the surgery, until they notice that the only people who don't have these are uglies and people in specific jobs. Which means there seems to be a way to select for it and to get rid of it. Which means it is completely intentional. In the books it's only implied, but in the movie it's explicitly mentioned that Maddie and As knew Dr. Cable and even used to be friends. But now she shows up at their lab, destroys all their research and threatens them to stop probing into that. Instead, they steal a lot of supplies and the hovercraft and flee. The reason they guide Uglies out of the cities, all cities close enough, not just Tally's city, is because they want to save them, but also because they are the only age group without these lesions and they want to see how humans behave if they don't have that. So basically a control group, but Maddie thinks too highly of her own moral to outright say that. Their theory is that humanity didn't actually stop all wars and prejudice and environmental damage because they progressed, but just because these lesions make people more complacent, happy, peaceful, and ultimately easier to control. What I find so compelling about this world is that it's genuinely very close to a utopia. At the cost of this, but for most people it doesn't even seem to be that big of a price. Their surgery is this promise that despite how weird and wrong I was as a teenager, it would be possible to make me fit in. A normal person would directly say that getting essentially brain damage for the price of fitting in and being happy is too much. But back then, I, as an autistic teenager who hadn't even accepted that I was queer, it's not a big price. I mean, what worth is my personality anyways? And that's so scary about this world. I know it's a dystopia, I know all the ways it is, and still I dreamed of this world because it's still better than our world. These lesions can be read as an own form of neurodivergence, but for me they work better as a symbol of being neurotypical and societal conditioning. The regime needs to make everybody's brain forcefully the same. They need to make everybody's body forcefully the same in some essentially arbitrary standard, which is a metaphor that works both for neurodivergence and queerness. This is also why people saying the movie misses the point, because not all of the uglies are actually ugly, makes me so angry. The point of these books is not plastic surgery is bad or treat ugly people better, but that beauty culture is a tool to enforce conformity and control. After that, Tally reassures David that now the smoke is her home, they kiss, and she throws the pendant into the fire. In the next morning, she awakes to absolute chaos because turns out the pendant also calls special circumstances if it is destroyed. This is the first time we see what the specials truly are. They have no weapons, no armor, they calmly stand at the edge of the smoke or walk between the rebels. Except again and again there is this grey flash, grey like their uniforms, and everybody they walked past is tied up on the floor. They say, "We don't want to hurt you, but we will if we have to." Which is such a chilling thing to say, but also such a good summary of this regime. Tally also briefly sees Shay, who's already captured but still fighting back, screaming how Tally is a traitor, and she was so enraged that she even managed to scratch one of the special's face. Tally almost managed to escape with the help of an older Smokey by blasting pepper spray right into the face of one of the specials. Turns out the only way you can win against them as a normal person is sensory overload. But then she is caught and dragged back to Dr. Cable. In the movie there's also the scene of Dr. Cable and Maddie finally on screen interacting, where Maddie shouts Dr. Cable's first name at her and basically tries to appeal to her humanity to just let the people choose. But it doesn't get through at all. Dr. Cable just stands there, completely unafraid, in a white robe with wide open hair in the middle of a battle, and then accuses Maddie of being the one who will only accept her own ideology, nicely showing the sheer amount of cognitive dissonance she has. Laverne Cox and Charmin Lee, who plays Maddie, acting off against each other is such a pleasure to see, and they have so much chemistry. Sadly, the movie then chooses something I consider very close to character assassination, which is Dr. Cable ordering someone to kill S in front of everybody. When in the book, she tried to erase his memories so that he could just live in the city, completely unknowing, but accidentally killed him because this was an experimental brain surgery. It is very important for the world building and for her character arc that she, while absolutely being willing to be brutal and ruthless and kill people, this is not really her first choice. First is manipulating, like she did with Tally, then putting people into the pretty surgery or making them specials, and only if that doesn't work, killing someone. Obviously not morally sound either, but it is quite different to how most dystopian dictators are written. Tally managed to escape again by claiming that the pendant, of which she knows that Dr. Cable doesn't want to have lying around there, is hidden near some hoverboards so that she can jump on one and very narrowly escape while Special Circumstances tries to shoot her off from one of their vehicles. David also managed to escape and is completely heartbroken, and they decide to make their way back to the city, where suddenly Tally is the one who has more experience in the area. They discover that there's a gap in the security system of the Special Circumstances building. It is a bit of a plot hole, but it's also really interesting world building. So hoverboards are pretty much only used by uglies or people even younger, so they aren't really seen as a serious way of transport and kind of this stupid teen thing. And additional to that, the specials are built to be confident, which means that they don't think about how you could reach a certain place of the roof without the sensors picking them up with a very risky hoverboard maneuver. In the book, Dr. Cable finds Tally rather fast, but Tally manages to distract her with groveling how she wants to help her long enough that David can sneak up on her and smack her unconscious with a tool against her head. And then they use her biometry to unlock all the other doors. In the movie, she managed to corner them, only to then have to find out that Tally had the idea to break up the group of already freed rebels and let the others get the Smokies helicopter, which also has a flamethrower, they then use against her. In my opinion, this works better because it's not really believable that they would manage to get a super soldier unconscious so easy. However, both of this also shows just how sturdy the specials are. She does end up unconscious from having a metal bar smacked against her head, but she isn't even bleeding and she also comes by relatively fast. And in the movie, having a flamethrower directed against her does slow her down enough to not follow the heroes, but a few hours later she's already following them with a hovercraft and only has a very light burn on the side of her face and a tinged eyebrow. Though I guess in the movie that could also be to avoid having to show Terminator-esque cyborg gore. In the book this works despite being somewhat too easy because it is not the actual climax of the book. Because Tally and David also run into a pretty who turns out to be Shay. Tally doesn't realize at first, just goes on rather long in her perspective about how beautiful this woman is and how she wants to do everything for her, and then realizes it is Shay and is absolutely horrified. And they managed to translate this into the movie by doing the scanning shot over pretty Shay's body, but because we know that Shay would have never consented to look like this, it's much more fan service. She has long feminine hair now and curves and wears a glittering dress and doesn't understand why Tally is so sad. The rest of the book is then trying to find out what to do with Shay, and also Tally trying to deal with Maddie and David resenting her for causing the death of Az. There is this one bittersweet moment where Tally and Shay fall asleep cuddled against each other, and Tally notices all the small details of how Shay's body changed. And I know that Americans are a lot more touchy than Germans, and also that this civilization comes across as even more open about physical touch, but I still don't think that cuddling with your female friend and knowing every detail about her body so well that you don't just notice what changed but can make a list about what changed is platonic behavior. Maddie managed to steal a good portion of Dr. Cable's notes and thinks she's able to reverse engineer a cure from this, but she doesn't want to use this on Shay if Shay doesn't consent, because it could likely be dangerous. Finally, Tally decides to sacrifice herself to be a lab rabbit for this cure and so save Shay. She writes a letter to her pretty self, and she has to dictate it to Shay because she's not able to write fast enough with a pen. Shay, with her now different brain, doesn't understand and laughs about things that are deep and painful for Tally. It reminded me at this very common experience between people with different neurotypes that there are some things that are so important for me but not for the other person. But it's especially jarring her because they started out as being the same. The second book, Pretties, is much more confusing and opaque, and I think I was too young to truly understand it back then. These books have a cyclical structure, so this again starts with Tally on a party, pretending to fit in but feeling that she doesn't. This insecurity even stays despite Tally being friends with Shay, who is seen as quite of the cool person in New Pretty Town. And despite the cruel new clique's leader, Zane, finding her interesting because of Shay's stories. And also her altered brain that should make her happy and complacent. Suddenly, one of the Smokies crashes the party, and it's not David. He manages to give Tally a note, but almost immediately special circumstances arrive. Tally panics so hard that she tackles one of the other people from the clique off the ceiling, holding onto him. He wears a bungee jacket, she does not. Against all odds, she doesn't get smashed on the ground, but she does get his knee into her face as the momentum drives him further. For a moment, the adrenaline and the pain from the wound on her forehead make her mind clear enough to not just notice that something isn't right, but almost understand what isn't right. And the next morning, she goes to find the note and the medication attached to it and runs into Zane. After her stunt on the party, he's even more interested and decides to tag along. He has a bit of a reputation as a rebellious bad boy, and he seemingly proves this by showing Tally a new trick, which is putting their interface rings on reeds on a lake so that they slightly move in the wind and the city interface thinks they are really sitting there and just slightly moving. Zane also explains that he is skipping meals and starving himself because he thinks that makes his mind clear. And Tally, who at this point feels that something is wrong but has her mind too murky and can't think clear enough to understand why this is not a good idea, decides to join in. Zane's eating disorder was foreshadowed already in his first appearance, but only very subtly. He gets all the typical bad boy descriptions, but Tally also mentions that he looks quite fragile, which he finds interesting. I will go into the eating disorder and self-harm representation later, which before the movie was the by far most common criticism of these books, but for that I need all the context of the second book. They find the pills on the transmission tower, but because the transmission tower is right in the middle of the city, everybody sees them. Which also means that special circumstances is there quite fast. There are 2 pills, and in their panic as they already hear the specials coming closer, each of them takes 1 pill. The book continues 1 month later. Tally and Zane have been interrogated, and they also both now have interface cuffs on their wrists, which they can't get off. They can't freely talk with each other because they know that the city is always listening. Tally also can't talk with Shay and explain what happened. And additional to that, for Zane, the cure also seems to manifest with strong headaches, but luckily not for Tally. They are welded together by this experience, which also enforces that they are the only people who truly understand what the other is going through. Tally is now also completely in with his eating disorder. They both think that they love each other and that it is a romance, but honestly, it feels a bit too uncomfortable to call it that. And I love seeing a YA romance that is a complete mess, but not because the guy is a misogynistic piece of shit. They are also now the de facto leaders of the clique and try to get everybody else to get bubbly, as they call it, by adrenaline-inducing actions. Everybody else notices that something about them changed, but they also notice how emaciated they are and don't know how to deal with either of this, and instead come up with nicknames that friendly mock how skinny they are now. Shay's resentful for being left out, but Tally is too foggy-minded and busy with the change, and also Zane's headaches to notice. The group manages to crash a flying ice rink as part of their plan with adrenaline acting as a cure. Afterwards they celebrate, but instead Tally and Shay get in a fight. Shay shouts at her about how hurt she is for Tally to share the cure with Zane and not with her. She calls her selfish and she says that she remembers everything. Every other way Tally ruined her life. Remember how I said that their friendship reminded me at my own toxic, closeted, bisexual teen girl friendships? I can relate to both of them so hard. It is so painful to see a female friend you know since years and maybe even love romantically prioritize her boyfriend she knows since at best a month over you. But I've also been called selfish for very similar situations as Tally. I don't naturally see the consequences my actions will have on others. I have to deliberately remember to think about this. And if there is a situation that is very stressful, like trying to fight a dystopian regime, it's hard to remember to do that. Tally also has this trait to latch at the last person, giving her attention and affection to the point of neglecting her other friends. It comes across as fear of being left behind. And it does not just happen with boys. Shay's in this position a few times too over the course of the series. I personally feel very seen in how human and flawed Tally is, but I can absolutely understand why people say she's unlikable. She absolutely is, and she also isn't really heroic. Tally runs after Shay, wanting to make amends, but instead she runs into Dr. Cable, who apparently had been lurking in the parks, as you do. She says that she always found the ice rink tacky, so it's not that big of a loss, and then goes into a full-blown eco-terrorist speech about humanity being cancer and their entire system being the cure. As an adult, it's a bit on the nose, but as a teen it worked really well for me. And it highlights this theme of what the true nature of humanity is, if humanity is inherently good or bad, and freedom versus security. Then she offers to recruit Tally into special circumstances. Disgusted, Tally declines. Now there's time pressure on not just finding a cure, but also finding a way to get rid of the interface cuffs and fleeing out of the city. Shay doesn't answer to any of Tally's calls, and Tally, along with Zane, only rather accidentally sees her again several days later as they train hoverboarding in the park. She has recruited all the people Zane had rejected from the cruel clique, and they all stand in a circle and chant something. It looks quite like a cult. Tally can't understand everything they say, but it sounds like they talk about having found some kind of cure. Then Shay pulls out a knife and cuts her lower arm, and everybody else, as part of the ritual, follows her lead. Pain and adrenaline as an attempt to get their head free. Tally backs away just as Shay sees her, guilty that this is her fault for not sharing the cure with Shay. As Tally and Zane try to get home as quickly as possible, Zane's headache turns into a full-blown seizure, and now Tally doesn't have any other choice than to bring him into the hospital. This also means that the doctors notice how unhealthily thin Tally is and force her into therapy. She doesn't cooperate, and the therapist doesn't really seem to want to help her, but more find out why she's behaving so strange and put her back into behaving like she should be. It's not really that big of a plot point, but I do find this interesting, because she would absolutely have needed therapy, but also, just like in real life, there's therapy that helps, and then there is therapy that just wants to make a neurodivergent person more palatable to everybody around them, no matter how they feel. Autism therapy is notorious for that especially. Finally, the group finds a way to remove the cuffs by putting heat-resistant gloves, like glassworkers use them, under the cuffs and then widen them with the heat of a hot air balloon flame just wide enough to get them off. However, Tally is distracted from jumping off the hot air balloon at the right moment by Paris realizing that he is not brave enough to become a rebel and trying to talk him out of it, and as she finally accepts that they will have to go separate ways from now, she is over a completely different part of the river. She breaks her hoverboard on the fall down, gets injured, and then gets stuck in a generation-spanning human experiment her city conducted, and can only flee by stealing the hovercraft of one of the scientists. She reaches the rest of the group who, as planned, have managed to get in contact with the remaining Smokies, only 2 weeks after the others. Side note, I love how this, despite kind of having the love triangle most people expect from this genre, with Tally having to choose between David and Zane, it still feels not as annoying, because both of these romances actually contribute to the plot, and both of these characters are at least somewhat interesting on their own. And they don't try to compete. They turn out to have become great friends in the time Tally wasn't there. David has forgiven Tally, but Maddie hasn't. She still hates her all the same. At least she explains that the two pills were meant to be taken together because the pill that Zane was taking contained nanos that would get rid of their lesions, and the one Tally was taking only contained nanos to stop these from eating a hole into the person's brain. That also means that Tally has more or less cured herself by placebo. And this is another thing a lot of readers don't really seem to understand, claiming, oh, she's so special that she managed to cure herself without medicine. But if you're mentally ill or neurodivergent in another way, you do know that it is possible, at least to some degree, to learn and fight your way out of some kind of harmful behavior. And it's not like she's just from one moment to the other completely cured. It is described that it is a constant struggle for her to keep her mind clean, that she envies Zane for how easy it seems for him. Maddie, upon examining Zane, notices that as he was in the hospital, they put in a position finder in one of his teeth. They can't remove it with the technology they have there, and she can see that it's activated. They have to leave him behind. Tally chooses to stay with him, which breaks David's heart, but at least he and all the others have a chance to flee as they can see special circumstances arriving. From her part of the abandoned room where they put their quarter, Tally can't really see most of what is happening, just that they come and take Zane away. Then Dr. Cable arrives, taunting her and explaining that she wanted to wait longer until activating the position finder so that she could be sure they had already arrived at the Smokies' hideout. But Tally stranding her colleague in the human experiment pissed her off enough to do it earlier. After that, Tally sits alone in the room for several hours, knowing that an anorexic 16-year-old can't outfight half a dozen super soldiers. She sees several specials arrive on hoverboards, which is strange because they usually don't use these, who apparently have managed to capture Fausto, so Paris' friend, who will become important later. They come closer and finally Tally recognizes them. Two of Shay's cult followers and her as the leader. She's described in the same androgynous or traditionally masculine descriptors like being brutal-looking and angular, and how wiry and strong her muscles look. Unlike Dr. Cable, she's also tattooed all over, and these tattoos move with her heartbeat. And she wears a sleeveless shirt to show off her scarred arms. Just like the description of Tally first seeing Shay as a pretty, it sounds equally marveling at how beautiful she is and being absolutely horrified. She instinctively knows that she is even worse than Dr. Cable, even lesser human. Shay mocks the slang the pretties use, asking Tally to rate how beautiful she finds her, and Tally answers with the highest possible rating. She continues to flirtingly toy with Tally. She explains that Dr. Cable was so intrigued by her cult that she made all of them specials. Shay's the leader of that unit, she's the youngest person to ever become a special, and she's also the first of a new prototype. She says that from now on, her and Tally are going to be best friends forever, and stabs Tally with an anesthesia to fly her back to the city and make her special too. For the next several weeks, Tally isn't ever truly conscious, just stuck in a fever dream as they do the surgery, and the only thing she can hear from the outside is Shay saying, "Face it, Tally, you're special." Which is absolutely my favorite last sentence from any book ever, because additional to the obvious meaning, this also sums up Tally's entire arc until now. And now, as promised, I talk about how this series handles self-harm and eating disorders. Full disclosure, I had self-harm issues, though luckily not as severe as Tally and Shay have, and also not cutting. Normally, it isn't a wise idea to open up to bullies, fandom, and puritans trying to justify why you like something that they claim is problematic. But here, this is important to see what this kind of rhetoric actually does to survivors. Before the movie came out and gave everybody an even easier target, reviews, videos, and posts about how this series glorifies self-harm, how this new unit of specials gets their superpowers with the adrenaline from cutting, how it makes teen readers harm themselves, were absolutely everywhere. Just aggressive fear-mongering that concludes that their whole series is worthless, that it shouldn't exist. So calls for censorship. I do not pretend that the representation is exactly ideal. What I do agree is not good representation is just how easy all of them manage to unlearn it. This sounds counterintuitive, but understanding just how hard it is to learn how to deal with these emotions in a healthier way only truly shows the gravitas all of these topics have. Because you cannot just stop having an eating disorder or self-harming because one single person told you that it isn't healthy. You need to work on yourself, you need to try out a lot of different strategies. Very likely you need to have a therapist or even medication. I also saw criticized how Shay and her cult are described in pretty negative and othering ways the first time Telly sees them. And Telly not ending up having organ damage or some other long-term effects from her eating disorder also downplays it a bit. Though it does make sense in the Watsonian way. The time span of the second book is not that long, and even more the special surgery. I don't want to go into all the gory details, but let's just say the special surgery is so invasive that there wouldn't be much left from Telly's original body afterwards, including her organs. So it makes sense that they would just replace them with healthier ones like it's standard procedure for the pretty surgery anyway. The characters absolutely glorify all of this, but there are some accurate parts. Telly and Zane get their eating disorder, and Shay and her cult get their self-harm problems from desperately trying to gain back control. And this is so often the reason why people start with this kind of behaviors. They have no control except for their own body. And it is not as clear-cut that these books falsely portray self-harm as creating a moment of clarity through the pain. For me, my reason was always that I had some kind of emotion so strong and horrible and painful that I couldn't get them to stop no matter what else I did, and in this moment, causing myself pain seemed like the best solution, at least subconsciously. Even if obviously it isn't. And this gets even worse if you are so deep into mental illness that you can't really think clear. Or, like in the book, have your brain altered to be muddled and complacent. These disturbing group dynamics of people enabling and even encouraging each other do exist in real life too. And distribute this newer, safer cure. But the narrative doesn't. It doesn't quite make the distinction clear enough, portraying both the eating disorder and even more the self-harm as very destructive and scary and disturbing, while also being forced to show all of this from the perspective of the characters. I'm just a bit flabbergasted how many of these people don't really seem to be able to deal with unreliable narrators. Because unreliable narrators in dystopias are really nothing new. Especially in adult dystopias, and I have to remind you again that this book came out before YA dystopia was mainstream and fully seen as its own thing, so it couldn't really fall back on other YA dystopias. Even more, do you really take Dr. Cale's word that self-harm is positive? At that point, she is shown to be manipulative, full of cognitive dissonance, and very ruthless already. Doesn't it make much more sense that she would just say that to Shay to manipulate her, because she's more useful when she's self-destructive and desperate like this? It is very telling how these people never acknowledge the other neurodivergent themes of these books, and quite often don't even acknowledge the eating disorder part, which in my opinion is handled worse than the self-harm part. But well, self-harm is more scandalous, right? They constantly talk about how they want to protect survivors from books like these. That meant that I couldn't truly have experienced this, right? Because if I had, I would hate these books and they would have harmed me instead of helped me. And I'm an ableist for liking them. So it also took me way longer than it should to start processing these experiences. Then I saw these one-note posts from other survivors describing how they felt seen in these books or even how they had helped them. There is a wide variety of opinions, and there are people for whom this truly was harmful, but there are also quite a lot of people like me. However, the only survivors who will ever get their opinion spread are these who happened to have the same kind of opinion neurotypicals expect. And I will forever be furious at these white knights talking over survivors. And yeah, as far as I know, these books are not own voices, but there are people like me in the fandom, and there are similar problematic depictions out there written by survivors. The first victim of censor attempts like this will always be own voices, people whose experiences and opinions isn't palatable to the majority. You are not actually protecting us like you claim. With this, we finally have all the context needed for the third book specials.